Welcome to Proles at the Round Table.
Hello and welcome to Proles of the Round Table, where we sit down, have a few drinks, and talk Marxist history. Check out our website at prolespod.com, where you can find our back catalog, links to all the resources we talk about, and a whole communist ebook library, along with a few recipes. If you want to extra support us, check out our Patreon, where you can give your hard-earned wages to a bunch of tankies in exchange for bonus episodes, clothes, and content. Find out more at patreon.com/prolespod. We wanted to thank this episode's primary sponsor, who enabled us to pay for the much-needed repairs to the cavernous Proles pad. Big thanks to our sponsor, the Central Intelligence Agency.
Once again.
Yeah, it's our good buddies. They've sponsored us on a few occasions. Hopefully the Ultras will start listening to us now. Wow, wow. So today is a very special episode of Proles of the Round Table, where we don't have any guests on. And
we're going to try to do this once a month.
We're going to shift, because we have done several months in a row where it's basically guests twice a month, or
so none of us have had to bother learning anything.
Right. So. Which has been nice, but
we're getting stupid.
But we are getting stupid. So we need to get back on historical, dialectical, whatever. Anyway.
Yeah, that's what I said. That's what I meant.
We're going to do something. So Ethan is going to have a little chat with us today.
Yeah.
What are we talking about today, Ethan?
We're going to talk about Burkina Faso. And we'll also talk about Thomas Sankara a bit, but I'm more, it's not just about Burkina Faso, like from during Sankara's time. Like I'm going to go from their pre-colonial history leading up to and including Sankara, and then a little bit of what happened afterwards. So
nice. And what are you drinking today, Ethan?
I'm drinking a Red Stripe, which was brewed in Jamaica, which is another former French colony.
This is Justin, and I'm drinking Bourgeoisie Tears.
God damn it, that's my drink. No, you drink a stupid ass cup.
Stealing that thunder like a colonizer.
Yeah, I know.
Yep.
Jesus Christ. Mad. It's okay. I'm gonna
Stealing Bourgeoisie Tear drinking valor.
This is my Bourgeoisie Tears. This is Alex, and I am drinking those.
The same thing.
My
sharing
Bourgeoisie
a cup.
You're
Tears.
sharing a cup.
They have
Is that what's
curly. They have
my
curly straws.
Bourgeoisie Tears.
Two long curly
He's
straws.
drinking out of
It's
a
like a
dumbass cup that says "My drinking friends have a gaming problem." Like it's like, ugh.
Like you're at a soda
St.
fountain.
Hop's cut, by the way.
Yeah.
You're at a soda fountain, and you're drinking a malt, but there's two straws coming out
Oh
of the.
yes.
That would be pretty blessed.
So I'm Jeremy, and I'm drinking Walter's premium quality Colorado refreshing craft lager, pre-prohibition American Pilsner. That's a
Jesus
stupid amount of description.
So it's a lager?
It is a lager, but it is hands down the maltiest lager I have ever drank in my entire
That's
life.
how it was pre-prohibition.
Apparently, I guess.
All they
go
had
with
were
that.
malts, no hops.
Yeah. So
No malts in this economy?
must be fucking nice. Ethan, where would you like to begin?
Oh, geez. All right. Okay. Couple of little provisos here. I do not speak French, and there are a lot of French words. I am going to try my best. I have looked up most of these pronunciations, and I will do my best. But please do not take offense if I pronounce something incorrectly. I recognize it's probably incorrect, and I apologize in advance. Also, I didn't know I was doing this until like 15, 20 minutes ago. I mean, I'd been researching, but I was just I didn't wake up today thinking I was going to do this. So buckle up. No. Okay. No, so I wanted to, so we're going to start with kind of the pre-colonial. I mean, so, okay. Obviously, the borders, the contemporary borders in Africa and most of the other places in the world are just kind of made up by white folks in the 1800s, and Burkina Faso is no exception. So we're just going to be talking about the region for a little while, which is on the sort of north part of the Volta River system. And so there was a wide variety of groups and cultures throughout most of recorded history in this area. The largest were the Mosi kingdoms, which were established somewhere around the 12th century CE. but so before then, everything was just kind of little villages and nothing like major. But so the Mosi actually are to this day the largest ethnic group in Burkina Faso with about 5 to 6 million people. And so the Mosi kingdoms, they ruled large portions of West Africa. And they did a lot of wars. They extracted tribute from the various places that they ruled. They had a central monarch who was referred to as the Mogho Naba, and he ruled from Ouagadougou, which is still the capital city to this day. They fought off Muslim armies coming from northern Africa. A lot of stuff going on. You could probably do a whole episode on them, but it's a lot of like archaeology and stuff. So the rest of Burkina Faso was a lot of small chiefdoms. And then most of the other people groups didn't have chiefs or territories, but just little small farming families. And some of these groups include the Lobi, the Dagara, the Durfor, the Ule, the Goransi, Gourmanche, the Bobo, and the Diola. There are a lot more, but those were the biggest ones that I could find. So we're going to jump all the way to 1888, in which you've got a French representative from Senegal. I mean, I don't know if he was from France or if he was a Senegalese person working for the French. I don't know. Came to Ouagadougou to convince the Mosi rulers to place themselves under French protection.
Very nice.
Which I'm sure...
It's like a mob protection racket, basically.
Very nice of them.
If you don't agree with us, we're going to do imperialism on you.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah, no, I mean, when you think about it, it was just really nice of the French to just like come and offer that. Like that's, yeah.
No strings attached.
Yeah, exactly. It's great. So the French eventually got in, not through asking nicely, but they made a deal with the northwestern province of Yatanga, the area. So those people were like, yeah, sure, you can come in. And from there, they put all their bases and they sent forces to conquer the rest of the area. So, bummer.
So, yeah.
Tales of this time.
Good is what you're saying?
That's what the English did in India, too.
Yep. So, so the region was governed as part of a larger French West African colony, which they called, variously at different times, and depending on who you're talking to, it was called either Sudan, Haute Senegal, or Niger. And so the next major event is 1915 through 16. There was a huge revolt against the French amongst the Bois, the Marca, and a couple of other West African peoples. There were 90,000 estimated rebels going into by the French. The only way the French could put it down was they killed 30,000 insurgents. They burned villages. It was fucking awful and huge. So then 1919, the French established like its own distinct state called Haute Volta, which means Upper Volta, which is how I will be referring to it. So yeah, it was called this because, like I said, the Volta River system starting in what's now Burkina Faso, it went through Ghana, which is south of it, into the Atlantic. And so there weren't a ton of European settlers and not very many military garrisons here. It was largely managed through civil administration. So locals working for the French ran everything on behalf of the French. And when orders came in from the French, then they would do that and then get their own. Like it was really beneficial for these locals to do this because they would get like money and all kinds of power from the French, but it also kept the French expenses down because they didn't have to send some white assholes to do this.
Imperialism versus colonialism.
Exactly. Yeah. And so leading French administrators were expected to basically replace local chiefs throughout the country. And they would work with them where possible. So there was a bureaucracy, but there was also patronage. Like the African employees of the colonial state used their position, like I said, to extort money, services, and goods from locals. And that was just that was normal. Like the French didn't give a shit. And then the French were, so compared to the British, like British colonies in Africa, the French were much more hands-on in terms of like dictating policy. The British kind of just said, as long as you send us like the money and materials we need, like we don't give a shit what else you're doing. But the French were kind of, to some extent.
Yeah. And I think it probably depends on which British colony in Africa. Yeah. The ones in Southern Africa, the Brits it was actually a colonial effort. Like they were bringing people in to take it over.
Yeah, in that sense. Yeah, where they're like settling the area. Yeah. But so this was, so even though this wasn't a hugely settler colonial, like it was a little bit, but it was mostly military.
Yeah.
but they weren't trying to like bring in and this is New France or whatever. They were just explicitly like, hey, you're going to fucking grow cotton for us.
Exactly.
Yeah. The French later were writing that the whole colonial system was a lot easier for them in the former Mosi kingdoms because there was a quote, a veritable feudal organization already exists. So they were just like,
Brr.
What?
Said burr.
Well, I mean, yeah, feudalism. What are you gonna do? But so like those systems were already there to like extract tribute, and they were like, let's just push it up one step further to France. And so it elevated the Mosi to kind of a privileged status amongst the ethnic groups in the area. And so most of the chiefs loved this. Like it worked well for them because it removed. So there were so within the various chiefdoms, as far as I can tell, a lot of them had these sort of systems in place where there was a chief running the area, but there were some forms of like checks and balances through the various societies or whatever. The chiefs really liked the French administration a lot of the time because it got rid of a lot of those checks and balances. So they could do all of their like, I'm running shit stuff, but without the like check from the people because the French didn't give a shit.
And that's the thing that kind of emerges like across most societal groups is that there will tend to be, if like to keep people from getting too much wealth or too much power, there's always some sort of a something to push back in the other direction to keep somebody from gaining absolute power or becoming absolutely wealthy. And it's, sometimes it's like they call it the potlatch system, I suppose, in like northwestern
like Pacific.
North America, the Pacific Northwest, where people would come and bring stuff and they would pile it all together and then they would distribute it out. And whoever brought the most got the most prestige out of that. And it was almost always the same people every time. But the fact that they were then giving those things back out in a more distributed way. Again, the person who brought the most got the most prestige out of it, but they did not then have the most material possessions in return. So it's kind of a weird, like, it doesn't keep them from having power. It just keeps them from having too much or an absolute amount. And that changes when you get to feudalism and capitalism.
Yeah. I mean, like, honestly, like colonialism and these sorts of accumulation, like it's obviously a huge topic. And it manifested differently all over the world. But I mean, there are a few, I don't know. It's like the history of Burkina Faso is also tied up with some of the other countries in that region, like Cote d'Ivoire, Ghana, and we'll mention them later. So anyway, so the main thing that France was having people in Upper Volta grow was cotton, because they already had cotton fields. So they were like, just make more cotton fields and ship that to us. And so people were compelled, quote unquote, to take time away from growing food so they could grow more cotton. So as a result, there was a lot of hunger that resulted from French colonialism, which is very cool, France.
Yeah.
So then in World War I, France conscripted. So most people don't know about this. Like, I didn't learn about this until a couple of years ago. France conscripted 200,000 troops from their sub-Saharan colonies, most of which saw combat in Europe. They took 200,000 people from these African colonies, shipped them up to Europe to fight in their fucking trenches.
Wow.
When I learned that, it blew my mind. But
I mean, Britain did the same thing with India.
Yeah, it's fucking wild. So then more uprisings in the 1930s, or 1920s and 30s, with some subdivisions of the area. They were still under direct military administration because that was the only way they could like tamp it down everything. Directed military administration up through the 40s. So there was this idea, and there sort of still is this idea of Burkina Faso or Upper Volta at the time as kind of resource poor, at least in terms of exportable commodities at the time. Like, it was one of France's quote unquote marginal colonies. They were like, it's whatever. Like, we get some cotton, but which is another reason they didn't want to set. Like, it's not as resource rich as some other regions, but that was the main like exportable commodity that didn't require a ton of work to get. So then in 1932, France merges Upper Volta with Cote d'Ivoire, and they named the new state Haute Cote d'Ivoire, which is Upper Cote d'Ivoire. So well done. but so Côte d'Ivoire is on the coast, and so it has more access to a number of things, and so there was within this new colonial state that had begun formed, a lot of the Mosi chiefs in Upper Volta really hated this because they were now lower on the hierarchy, because the people in Côte d'Ivoire had a more privileged position already, and so then they just added. So now like Upper Volta was just like the afterthought, like the second section. So a lot of the chiefs hate this. So the next big thing is 1945. France rescinds a lot. So the wars just ended. They just got back their country from the Nazis, and they're trying some new things, which do not include independence for their colonies. But so they rescind a lot of the really draconian colonial laws, included like regarding forced labor and some legal structures, and they allow for more freedom of press and assembly, is what they said.
That's what they say.
We'll see how much. I mean, yeah, obviously. Yeah, whatever. So France created the French Fourth Republic and the French Union, which they officially claimed. So it's not France and its colonies, like it's two separate things anymore. It's France, the various colonies and territories, and the protectorates. We're all just part of one big unified France.
Oh.
Wow, cool. Yeah.
The Commonwealth.
Yeah. Yeah. And so there was ostensibly some representation for the colonies, but I mean, like they had like, oh, there's like an assembly like that you can send representatives now. You're like states.
You exist.
Yeah, you're real. But like, obviously they weren't going to give any consideration to the, it's the kind of thing like, oh, listen, you have these democratic structures. What are you mad about? Like, as opposed to, wow, the fucking material structure of power and resources are
We're still going to do exactly the same things we were doing before.
They just have it on a piece of
But
paper.
now you can't complain as much because we're giving you a say in it.
Yeah, I wonder to what degree that would have worked for like Britain to give the American colonists some like token votes in Parliament.
Mm-hmm.
Like if that would have been enough for them to be like, oh well, we've now got votes, so we can't say no taxation without representation.
Exactly. You got representation now. Shut the fuck up.
Yeah.
We matter.
I mean, it wouldn't have mattered because it wouldn't have been enough to counteract the will of the British Parliament, which is, of course, what's going on here in France. But
yeah. Well,
it's a token thing.
Yeah, exactly.
Give someone.
Yeah. So the more progressive Upper Volta nationalists, they were working with the regional Côte d'Ivoire party, which was the Rassemblement Démocratique Africain, which is the RDA. And they worked with the French Communist Party. RDA worked with the French Communist Party on decolonization and like trying to advocate for independence, which worried both the French and some of the Mosi elites in the Upper Volta. They were like, well, listen, this is working out really well for us. We don't know about independence. Yeah. And I mean, and that's just such an interesting thing about like, you know, privilege amongst exploited classes.
Yeah.
I mean, it happens all over the place. But.
Sure.
So 1947, France reconstitutes Upper Volta as its own colony again, because they were worried about like a decolonial movement with combined forces of Upper Volta and Côte d'Ivoire. So they're like, all right, we'll separate you again. So, and so they added a territorial assembly, which meant that the Mogo Naba and his advisors had to form a political party along with the other chiefs. And so basically, like all the chiefs like had their own party. So obviously the RDA got fucked in Upper Volta because all they had was, you know, some popular support as opposed to the power structure. So
very cool.
Yeah, it's super cool. In the 1950s, the RDA in Côte d'Ivoire is led by this guy named Felix. Oh fuck! I looked this up. It's a tough one. Felix. Is it
the H one?
Houphouët Boigny. It's two long names that are hyphenated. It sucks. So the party, they dial back some of their radicalism. So they can become a little more palatable to the French. They're like, listen, we're not gonna do any of this crazy stuff. Like we're just nice. We're just nice we're just nice colonies who want to play well with others.
Sure.
And so France was like, all right, cool. So then in 1956, they expand the RDA, which they called the Parti Démocratique Unifié. Or Unifi, I'm not sure, which is the PDU.
No.
I was wondering how long it would take before we got one of those. And so it wins a majority in the assembly. And so this assembly was still basically run on bribes and favors to chiefs and the other important electors, similar to the United States electoral system. And so then the RDA's main leader in Upper Volta at this time is Ouzine Coulibaly. Again, sorry, I'm doing the best I can. He was one of the first voltaic nationalists, as opposed to advocating for a return to the traditional Mosi rule. Because before this point, people would be like, no, we just got to go back to like the chief structure and all this. This guy is one of the first who's like, okay, well, we're organized as like a fucking state anyway. Like, let's just be an independent one.
Right. What if we did something new?
And he didn't really talk about independence, I guess. He just was talking about Upper Volta being a thing, like a coherent thing. Like we're all voltaic. We should all join together here.
So that's an interesting like question. Like if Upper Volta only exists as a construct made via colonialism, but it's also a way for people within that region to sort of identify and create power structures out of it. Like that's a weird dichotomy, right? Because it only exists
absolutely.
because of colonialism,
Right.
but then it can be used like it's sort of like Vietnam. Vietnam as an entity was not pure. I mean, it was a kingdom, and kingdoms are therefore they don't have rigid borders the way that states do. But like it's a
contradiction.
colonial construct that then becomes a power structure to be used against colonialism.
Well, right, and
It's
I
interesting.
think
The seeds of decolonization are sown by colonialism.
It's all excited. Well, I was just saying it makes sense. You bond together over your oppression. You want to come together as an identity to smash the oppressor. And at that point, it's like, we did have our distinct ethnic groups and stuff like that, but we all are being fucked over by the French,
Interesting.
That face.
fucking French. So Ghana, 1957, Ghana, which is directly south of Upper Volta, they gained independence under Kwame Nkrumah, who he'll come up again soon. We could and probably should do an episode on him. He was an interesting figure.
He's got like one of my favorite quotes about the U.S. where it's like the United States is a one-party state, but in typical American extravagance, they have two. I'm like,
it's
so good.
Yeah, just like chef kiss on each of the
Bless.
fingers.
Each of the fingers, all 10 of them.
It's excellent. Yeah.
It's like I just ate a plate of ribs.
No, it's excellent, and it just says so much about U.S. politics. No, he was a really interesting figure, so we should probably do an episode on him someday. So then in 1958, the French Fifth Republic is created. They're just going through these republics. The Fifth Republic is actually the one that still technically currently exists. There's a continuity,
like Fourth International or
the first president was Charles de Gaulle. Who fucking cares?
Charles the Gaulle.
The Gaulle?
Yeah. So who cares? He was an asshole.
Charles of Gaulle. Is it? Yeah.
Yeah.
De.
So he advocated for what he called the French community, the creation of the French community, which was like, so whereas the French Union of before was like, hey, listen, we're all just part of big France. The French community was like, no, France is like the main thing. And then like you guys are our friends. And so there was some autonomy on paper, but it reaffirmed the centrality of France. But de Gaulle was like,
we are the world.
Yeah. And so de Gaulle was like, if you guys, so whichever of the countries and colonies votes no, you can go your own way. We're not going to be mad. Like you can just do whatever you want. So only Guinea voted no. And so then they were instantly like kicked out on their own. No, it was just everything completely cut off, like all aid. And so they're like, okay, fine, fuck you. So the RDA supported the proposal in Upper Volta, as did the Mouvement Démocratique Voltaique, the MDV. And it was opposed by the Mouvement de Libération Nationale, the MLN, and the Parti Africain de l'Indépendance, which is the PAI. So basically it was 91% in favor in Upper Volta for staying part of the French community, because like the alternative was like get fucked and get thrown into a hostile world with nothing.
All right. So this is by Feyerabend in his paper called Against Method. And it says, it is true that Western science now reigns supreme all over the globe. However, the reason was not insight in its inherent rationality, but power play. The colonizing nations imposed their ways of living and the need for weapons. Western science so far has created the most efficient instruments of death. The remark that without Western science, many third world nations, and that's in quotes,
Right.
would be starving is correct. But one should add that the troubles were created, not alleviated, by earlier forms of, and again in quotes, development. So, like, the reason that these countries are in a shit state and did not want to leave the union with France is because of France's like intervention in earlier times made it so that they could not survive without France.
Yeah, 100%.
Nice.
Thanks, Jeremy.
There you go. There's that quote that I.
It's a good quote.
It's a good quote.
It's pretty good.
So in 1958, Coulibaly dies, and the Mogonaba at this point, Kugri, who's this 27-year-old dude, proposes a constitutional monarchy in UV to maintain influence. The legislators in like their little national assembly refuse, and so the Mosi interests and the Mogonaba's interests, they send 3,000 armed warriors to the assembly, and then they disperse when France threatens to disperse them with the military. So this backfires and prompts widespread anti-chief structure sentiments. People being like, listen, this shit sucked for most of us, except unless you were a chief. And so they get a new government formed run by the head of it was Maurice Yameogo. So the next year, 1959, de Gaulle announces, okay, so these French community territories, you can become independent and we'll still give you aid. So like they see the way things are going, and France sees the way things are going, and they still want to maintain some influence. They're like, okay, you can become independent. We'll still give you money. Like, it's not going to be like what happened to, it's not going to be like what happened to them, I swear.
I promise.
And so Yameogo, he starts talking a big game about national sovereignty. And so these 6 opposition figures, they send a letter to Yameogo. They suggest a coalition government between these different parties, and he has all of them arrested. And so the leader, around this time, the leader of the MLN, which was the one that opposed becoming part of the French community, the leader of him is Amadou Dicko. He said, throughout the era of the indigenat and forced labor, symbolized by the clerk, the interpreter, and the canton guard, was the occupier's most zealous auxiliary. Now he sees that possibility that his wildest dreams may be answered, that he has a chance to take the place of the commandant. So it's the people who helped. He was saying the people who helped out the French colonial administration, they're looking like they're seeing franc signs. They're seeing like, this is my chance.
Right. They're saying like, okay, well, these colonial administrators who were French are moving out, and now I can take their place and do their same job. But like acting as a go-between.
Exactly. So 1960, Upper Volta becomes independent from France. So Yameogo's government, they don't allow French military bases, which is nice. Tons of French military officers become quote unquote technical advisors. And most of the state services are run by quote unquote technical assistants, which are mostly French. And so the French government regularly gives money to Upper Volta in exchange for still being part of the Financial Community of Africa, which is the CFA, which uses the CFA franc as the colonies had since 1945. And I believe they still use that currency in the region in West Africa. So this new state, it mostly keeps the colonial state structures, but it increases the importance of regional leaders of the RDA in order to basically flex on the chiefs, which Yameogo viewed as like political threats, basically. And so he regularly denounced feudal, quote unquote, feudal attitudes and practices, made it so that any chiefs fulfilling administrative functions regionally had to be elected by the people they were running. He drafted a couple of bills like that were decent, I guess, like trying to regulate polygamy, child marriage, bride prices, but he never really implemented them in any efficient way. And also there was still this parallel court system where the chiefs could kind of handle their own legal issues. So there was no teeth to anything the state was doing. Hundreds of new civil servants hired. They formed this big bureaucracy. See, Stalinists aren't the only ones who can do it. Form this big bureaucracy, but it's not super effective, as you can imagine, because many of them are embezzling state funds, taking bribes, just not really doing their jobs effectively. I mean, I guess their job is to make a lot of money, so they were great at that. So Yameogo made some superficial attempts at Pan-African ties. Like he chatted up Kwame Nkrumah in Ghana. And so since Nkrumah was a Marxist, this was probably just an attempt to scare Upper Volta's patrons, i.e. France and like NATO, into increasing their support. Because in 1965, Yamaogo, he's visiting Washington and he presents Upper Volta as this anti-communist bastion. He's like, listen, all this communist shit in Africa, like not here. Like we are going to stand firm against that, because he's looking for military aid. So he starts including in his speeches, he starts including all these screeds against like communist subversion and Chinese invasion. So he was interesting in that he alienated pretty much everybody in Upper Volta. Yamaogo did. The masses didn't like him because he sucked and didn't do anything. And he was just like a holdover of the colonial era. The unions didn't like him because he cut their salaries because he was doing austerity. And he was like building multiple presidential palaces. And some of the elites didn't like him because he announced this dual citizenship agreement with Cote d'Ivoire, which they didn't like from like a nationalism perspective. So 1966, Yamaogo, he cuts every state employees, like everyone's salary they can, he cuts by 20%. And then like within like a month, I think, he gets married and goes on this big, like well-reported and documented honeymoon to Brazil and the US. And so as a result, people are like, man, fuck this guy. Right. And they start having like, there's protests and a general strike in January 1966. So it's somewhere between 25,000 and 100,000. Somewhere in there.
That's a huge spread.
The sources were like, it's somewhere between there. It's like, okay. In any case, whatever it was probably the largest single protest in Upper Volta history. Cool. And they were their main calls were for bread, water, and democracy. And they were calling for his resignation. So Yamaogo, he's like, all right. He orders the military to shoot the protesters.
Jesus.
And then the military refuses.
Nice.
So then that same night, he announces, all right, the wage cuts are going to be rescinded. Like I was just kidding with that. But then,
unless,
but then the protesters don't go home. Like nobody goes home, and so he resigns on January 3rd, 1966. So there's a power vacuum. So this Lieutenant Colonel Songule Lamizana takes over. So he wasn't as bad comparatively, which is not saying a ton. Sure. He paid off the like really annoying trade unionists, like the ones who would make a big stink. He paid them off. The student activist, like the really angry student activists, he gave them scholarships to study abroad.
Wow, sneaky, Jesus.
The country, and he dissolved the National Assembly, and the country stayed pretty poor and underdeveloped and really reliant on French and Western aid. So after a year, the teachers union, which the teachers union will come back, keep them in mind, pressured the government into prosecuting the previous president, Yamaogo, and 8 other top officials. And Yamaogo was sentenced to 5 years of hard labor, which he only served 1.
Whack.
Yeah. So Lamizana did anti-corruption stuff, which maybe allowed him to implement some harsher austerity measures than Yamaogo had. Fired hundreds of state employees, cut wages by 10%. There were taxes that you would have to pay as a state employee there was called a patriotic contribution. It was half of a month's pay. It was crazy. Yeah. And so the interesting thing is that most of these policies didn't really affect the rural population because they didn't really interact with the state institutions at all, except unless it was through the chiefs.
Sure.
So in 1968, hundreds of chiefs from around the country, they meet in Ouagadougou at the Mogonaba's palace. And they're like, we're going to start a chiefs union again. And so they appeal to Lamizana for their old privileges, like that they'd had under like the colonial administration. And he basically granted them. He's like, oh, that's fine. And so the chiefs basically became these indirect local agents of the state in their regions. And so there were some issues with that in that, like, the National Students Association said the chiefs rule is basically as, like, the quote from the spokesperson was, the chiefs rule as monarchs over the subjugated natives. The largest Upper Volta Women's Federation were like, listen, the chiefs' courts, they uphold practices that severely limit women's rights. This is whack. So in 1969, Lamizana reallows some political parties. He convenes a carefully appointed constitutional committee. Like, he chooses everybody on it. It's very conservative, but Lamizana only gives it advisory powers. And it retains a large role for the military. Like 1/3 of the ministers are going to be in the government are going to be military officers. And the presidency goes to the most senior military official, which just so happened to be Lamizana because he was the senior general.
Convenient.
Yeah, just funny how that worked out. So the political parties complain about the first draft of this constitution. They're like, this shit sucks. And so Lamizana changes a couple things, and then they're like, all right, let's put it to a referendum. 75% of the eligible electorate shows up. 98.6 say yes, which is interesting.
Wow.
1971, so they formed the Second Republic, and it's a cabinet of 10 civilians and 5 military, and basically nothing changes in the state or economic organization. It's just they shuffle around some titles and some people. So 1970.
That's basically what happens in every U.S. election.
Yeah, exactly.
Shuffle around some titles.
Yeah.
It's
Nothing
like,
really changes.
It's like, well, no, man. It's like the Facebook post I saw once. It was like, the United States is the only country in the world where we have a revolution every 4 years.
Fuck you. Why did you say that to me?
I saw it and I hated it.
I could live my whole life never hearing that.
I can't
wanna
believe
cry.
those
Can you
words have been
imagine
uttered.
thinking that.
Oh, fuck.
I can imagine believing that. So 1972, there was a drought, and it's known as the...
I know.
I know, I'm sorry. It's
We need
bad.
to
Like
put me out of my misery.
brain.
Yeah.
Just have a brutal
Like the Men in
alcoholic
Black.
spree to
Yeah.
wipe that memory.
Blacking out today.
So 1972, it's what's known as the Sahel drought, because that's the region, like the Sahel region. And it's affecting Upper Volta, a couple of the other countries in the area. It's a famine.
Which communist government was in charge of this famine?
No.
All famines are.
That's true.
the
No, that's true.
responsibility of
Let's see.
communism,
1971. Who was in charge? It was probably Mao's fault.
It's Mao.
And what was it? Brezhnev? Yeah, Mao and
Brezhnev
Brezhnev.
was 71?
I think
Yeah,
so.
I think so.
Yeah. So it was Mao and Brezhnev's
Yeah,
fault.
their fault. Okay. Yeah. Just
Maybe
want to make sure.
Nkrumah was probably involved.
Oh.
Tito.
Tito. Christ.
Yeah.
Fidel.
Fidel.
Fidel,
Yeah,
yeah.
absolutely. It's like, you gotta send some of that food over here to Cuba.
Is that when Che Guevara was in Africa?
Yeah.
Oh, fuck, it might have
That
been.
might have been his fault.
That's why.
Yeah, that's true. Yeah, but so basically this famine killed, like, we don't know how many people it killed, but entire villages disappeared.
I feel bad about making jokes now that you're talking about how many millions of people died.
There's a lot. Well, because people, like, entire villages disappeared as people went south for food and water, like, to the cities.
Yeah.
And so they're, like, everyone left, so the village was gone. And the government didn't acknowledge that a drought was happening until February 1973. And like their grain you guys will like this one. The grain distribution structures were basically non-existent, and it allowed private merchants to hoard grain and gouge people on the prices.
Wonder where else that happened.
Some people maybe with like tight fists that maybe in like Western Russia and in the Ukraine, tight fists. What are they called?
Maybe like kulaks would be a good
I
name.
think kulak is the right name. Yeah. I think it
Rings a
literally
bell.
means fist, but the implication is they have a tight fist and they're holding on to these resources.
So, so there was popular anger towards the merchants because people saw that this was
Yes.
fucked up. But the government policy basically just kept empowering the merchants to do whatever they wanted.
Maybe
so-
they should have fucking executed him.
And so there were some officials. Listen, what ethnic group are kulaks again?
Hey.
No, but so some officials, like civilian and military officials, were embezzling money at this point when, like, people are starving to death. They're embezzling money, and so only a handful of low-level players, like in this whole conspiracy, saw any jail time. And so around this time, Watergate was in the news, and so like the UV media were referring to this as Sahelgate, like the people embezzling, which is funny. So yeah, around this time, 71, 72, there's social unrest. Like high school students were boycotting classes, and then the police cracked down on the high school students. 3 labor federations and a bunch of other labor unions demanded a minimum wage increase and anti-corruption measures, and they threatened a general strike, and they got a 10% wage increase. But the teachers union stayed mad, and they kept striking all through 1973. And so the prime minister at this time, his name was Gerard Ouedraogo. He called the strikes an insurrection, and he says it's not fair for people to blame the government for everything.
Not fair.
So
Sounds like Ebert in the quote unquote Spartacist uprising.
owned.
We should do an episode on that.
So
We should redo an episode on that.
Probably.
So 1974, Lamizana, he suspends the Constitution. He dissolves the National Assembly. He bans party activities. He's like, all right, fuck all this. He reorganizes the government into 10 departments, all headed by military officers.
Ooh.
The military gets a third of the national budget.
Wow.
Yeah.
It's like
And
the
they're not
US.
even, but they're not even maintaining like imperial holdings.
Yeah.
Like, I don't know what the fuck they're spending all this money on. And so 75, Lamizana forms a party called the Mouvement National pour le Renouveau, I believe. And none of the politicians accepted it. Like none of the people, everyone was like, this is a terrible idea, buddy. Like you're posting cringe right now. And so about this time they have
It's 5 years hard labor.
for posting cringe.
Posting cringe, yeah, for sure. I'm gonna get like 35 by the time.
Sad.
Yeah.
Life for cringe. So there's a brief border war in 75 with Mali, which is called the Agadir Strip War. It's a 100-mile strip on the north end of Upper Volta. There's a lot of oil there. So it's probably just a coincidence that they were going to war with this
I'm
particular
sure.
region. The oldest maps, like colonial maps from like the 20s, said that the villages in the area were what it could be considered Upper Volta, but Mali was like, well, those are colonial boundaries, it's fake. And so Upper Volta was like, no, it's not fake. That's ours. So, and some people were suggesting that the reason it popped off at this point was because this is around when Upper Volta's moving to military rule, and then the Mali government was like stupidly unpopular. So they were like, well, we'll do some nationalistic war. That always helps.
Fun.
Yeah. So Lamizana, he abandons his party idea. He gives a 25% minimum wage increase, new national union cabinet with more civilians, start on a new constitution, which is approved by referendum. So then, we're going to do about the end of the 70s. And you still see military officers, like people would see in the cities, military officers with like all these new cars and motorcycles, lots of soldiers and cops and French expats. And there's like fancy villas in certain parts of the capital. And then Lamizana's at the same time publicly condemning these traitorous elites, but like he's the president and he doesn't do shit. So
Drain the swamp.
yeah, exactly.
No.
It's exactly like it's pretty much exactly that. Fuck, so stupid. So then in 1980, there's a coup led by Colonel Sai Zerbo. They, as usually happens, suspend the constitution, dissolve the National Assembly again, prohibit all political activity. And they established a military government called the Comité Militaire de Redressement pour le Progrès National, the CBRPN.
That's it?
CBRPN, yeah, I guess. So Zerbo, he gets into power and he's like, Lamizana had gone soft, which is always what you want to hear from like someone running a military coup.
Yeah.
But like initially there was widespread public support because of how fucking shitty the Lamizana government was. Like the teachers unions who we've heard of a number of times being pains in the ass of the government, they declared their willingness to work with the new government. And so the government, in response, quickly unveils an austerity program.
Very cool.
Very cool.
This ain't very cool stuff.
Well, and there's very little oversight. In 1981, 6 billion francs were unaccounted for.
Jesus Christ.
Just in that year.
That's crazy.
And so there's lots of officials giving themselves high salaries and benefits, hiring their friends and family for positions, selling off government vehicles and equipment just like themselves. It's like, yeah, I'm gonna sell this government car and like you just pay me. You can just pay me for that. Yeah, exactly. You just pay me for that. So they would do like trials of low-level officials when they got exposed for like blatant theft, like I have a picture of him holding the sacks of money, but
He's wearing like a bandit mask with like a big sack with dollar signs on the back running away.
Yeah, exactly. But like nobody important ever got touched, and they would only even go after the low levels.
That's how a lot of stuff
That's
happens.
how it goes. Yeah,
like you literally have to like. I had this conversation with somebody recently where I was like, the bar for most people believing that like a cop is a racist is they have to see like the SS tattoo on their arm, and they have to have like given the Roman salute and said Sieg Heil as they were murdering a black person using the N-word and putting on a KKK and burning a like
that's the thing. Like people's like
you must do all
you
of
have to
these
do all those things at the same time to be considered racist.
Yes. Otherwise, it's like,
I don't know. But like even I mean, fuck, there was that cop a couple years ago in like Philadelphia. He had the fucking eagle. And they were like, it's his heritage. It's just his culture.
German. Yeah, it doesn't mean anything political by it. Fuck you.
Yeah, it's awful.
Ugh.
So, so at this time, one of the heads of the second biggest bank in the country, he embezzled 500 million francs himself. The Minister of Finance, he was taking money in exchange for fake wheat import documents. The senior postal officials embezzled 9 million francs. Like everyone was just going nuts. And so then there was, at the same time, widespread real estate speculation. So like workers couldn't afford to live in the capital. Like, sounds like,
sounds like San Francisco.
This is only 40 years ago, but like you can see a lot of the, like, it's like the testing ground for a lot of like neoliberal policies.
Sure. Yeah.
And so a lot of this actually gets made public for a few months starting in 1981 because the government appoints a new Secretary of Information who's a military captain named Thomas Sankara.
Who dat? Maybe you've heard of him.
Well, so he started he's in charge of like the government information and outreach, and he starts telling journalists, hey, if you find out fucked up shit, you publish it. You're not gonna get in trouble. You got to report the truth. And so Sankara, like, he wasn't in that position for long because he was so but his main success was he got live TV broadcast of the world, like a live TV broadcast of the World Cup broadcast to Upper Volta, and made France pay for it because the only way they could do it was like, they were like, okay, he was saying to France, all right, set up some satellites. You're gonna set up a whole satellite TV network so people can watch the World Cup in Upper Volta. And it was super expensive, so France was like, I don't know about that. And Sankara, like, he said, all right, if you don't do this, I'm gonna go talk to the Libyans and ask them to pay for it. And so like they're like, oh fuck, so they paid for it and did it. So the CIA hears about like possible like collusion with Gaddafi and the Libyans, and they get laser eyes, like.
And they're like, France, you better pay for this.
Yeah. Well, yeah, and then they start focusing on they start paying a little more attention to BF or to Upper Volta than they were. So yeah, 1982, widespread strikes lead to government crackdown. And in April, Sankara resigns. He says, like in a statement, "Woe to those who would gag their people." So in then November 1982, there was another coup. And they started a new government led by Jean-Baptiste Ouedraogo, called the Conseil de Salut du Peuple. I don't know how you say that word. It's the CSP. We looked it up. It's the Council for the People's Salvation, which is kind of a cool name, but
that'll be the name of our party. Okay.
I'm going to change the website. So Sankara at this point had become somewhat popular because he was a public figure and people were like, damn, this guy seems dope. And so he'd been approached to be involved in the coup, but he said, listen, do you have a political platform? And they were like, no, we're just going to take over the government. No, we'll figure it out. And he's like, no, you have to have a fucking political. You can't just take power and figure out where you stand afterwards. You have to know why you're like what you're going to do. And they were like
a vanguard.
Well, he was, I mean, we'll talk about this in a little bit. He was reading a lot of Marxism and post-colonial theory. So. Nice. So anyway, he wasn't part of the coup, but after the coup, they were like, okay, we're in power. Do you want a position? He's like, all right, I guess. So the composition was mostly lower military officers for once. They forced a lot of the senior officers to resign. So, I mean, still military, but like, I guess it's something. And so Sankara, he was appointed as the prime minister of the government. And at his swearing in ceremony, he says the people want freedom, but this freedom must not be confused with the freedom of a few to exploit the rest through illicit profits, speculation, embezzlement, and theft.
Yes.
Absolutely.
There you go.
And so he spoke, and so
it'll be like, PG-13 rated films. You get like one curse word. You get like one. No, you
get one fuck, or one. You can
fuck.
Say shit a couple. You have like 5 shits.
Yeah.
And one fuck.
You get one air horn per episode.
There you go. We'll compromise with the angry hordes. So Sankara, he speaks on behalf of the government to the Congress of Teachers Unions.
Radical centrism.
Yes.
God damn it.
He speaks on behalf of the government to the Congress of Teachers Unions, and he was critical of the union movement's collusion between some unions and the forces that oppress the masses. He was like, hey, some of these unions, you're working with the fucking elites.
Like the AFL-CIO.
Oh, fuck. The AFL-CIO. Yeah. Jeremy just dabbed, which is totally justified. That union sucks. Okay. And then yeah, so he's appointed as the prime minister, and he also is giving a statement in his swearing-in ceremony where he says Upper Volta needs to break free of external dependency. And at this point, like, most people aren't really talking about that. Nobody's talking about this. And so there's a completely split government. And they're like, okay, well, we're going to transition to a civilian government in 2 years, we swear. And a lot of people suspected that this was just because they were going to restore the old guard, including maybe the old, like two governments ago, Yameogo, the guy who did 1 year of hard labor. Like, he was in with some of the people.
Build a proper gulag, for Christ's sake.
Yeah. And so this government had a really complicated relationship with the chiefs. The president told them they're the eyes and ears of the state among the people, basically auxiliary state organs. Something fun is that the state power company cuts off the electricity to the Mogo Naba's palace because they had never paid the electrical bills. I just thought that was funny.
That's amazing.
That was funny. So February, Sankara pays a state visit to Libya. Meets the new guy over there, Muammar Gaddafi, who we'll probably do an episode on at some point.
Oh man,
there's a lot there.
Complicated. So
heavy.
It's a lot. It's a lot.
Yep.
Can we get Hyder back to talk about Gaddafi?
No, probably not.
Authoritarian social democracy. No. Okay. Yeah. And so in April, Gaddafi returns the gesture. He visited them too. So there's like, we got legit relations happening here. March, Sankara visits a little country called the DPRK.
Ooh.
Yeah. And he on his on that trip, he represents Upper Volta at the non-aligned movement meeting in India. So the non-aligned movement, if you're not familiar, I mean, it's another fucking topic we could do a whole episode on. So basically it was like people, they were officially not on either side of the Cold War, but like, so Castro basically helped, like, was one of the people who ran it. So, I mean, he was.
And what year was this?
This was 82. Yeah, this is 82. No, this is 83. What?
Big thunk.
What?
I mean.
Well, no, I mean, Castro was clearly on one side of the Cold War.
Yeah.
So, like, but it was just people like they're. Yeah, again, it's a complicated thing. But so he went to.
It's fucking like, I feel like. I don't know. Like, I get the reason people did this because the US will fucking destroy anyone who, sides with the Soviets, that they feel like the Soviet Union will not expend effort on defending. But it's also like third way bullshit.
No,
right?
I know.
Like,
and it's complicated and yeah,
and of course
it didn't really end up doing anything.
Yeah.
Like it didn't.
I feel like it's sort of like the Sino-Soviet split, right? Yes, of course, revisionism is garbage, but you have to work within the systems.
But it's
you
better to work with the
revisionist
USSR than like literally the United States.
Right, exactly.
China did.
So right, which is a thing that Mao did. Sorry, Maoists.
Wait till we do our
Sino-Soviet split episode.
We're gonna make everyone mad at us.
We are. Sure. Yeah,
I'm scared.
Again, revisionism bad. However,
the US
revisionism, revisionism preferable to capitalism.
Yes.
Yeah.
Right. Particularly neoliberal capitalism.
Yes. This is peak time for this.
Yeah.
Yeah. So so they're at the non-aligned movement meeting in India. He meets Fidel Castro for the first time. He meets Samora Machel of Mozambique, Bishop of Grenada, and he joins in like officially declaring support for the rebels in El Salvador and the Sandinista government in Nicaragua, which was like the U.S. was actively trying to oust at this point. And so when he gets back, when Sankara gets back, he speaks at a rally. So he's speaking at a rally with the president. He talks before the president. So he gives his whole speech. He gets a huge response. Everyone loves it. President gets up. Everyone's quiet. Like literally there's not like applause cheering. Like people are just quiet. And then he starts talking. The president starts talking. And then people start leaving and chanting Sankara, Sankara. So in May, the president, Ouedraogo, he announces that Sankara and the Secretary General of the CSP, which was one of those parties in the government, they've been removed, quote unquote, because they were communist provocateurs. He also, at the same time, dissolves the main organs of the government and forms a new cabinet made of right-wingers, which is awesome.
Very cool.
So allegedly, some have suggested, allegedly France was involved with this. some of the timing of some ambassador visits and some business agreements between Upper Volta and France like was a little questionable, maybe because like right after
so
they're
France
like
was involved. Is
yeah,
basically what
clearly
you're saying.
like they were like get rid of these fucking guys
Yeah.
and we'll give you a bunch of money,
Right.
and it happened. Widespread, occasionally violent protests because they remove Sankara and put him in jail, and so there's protests with people like chants include free Sankara, like a bunch of anti-imperialist slogans, anti-French shit. It was dope. And so right around when this goes down, a friend of Sankara, who's also in the military, Captain Blaise Compaoré, remember his name, they rally support at one of the main military barracks outside of Ouagadougou, which is in a city called Po. It was like a really big challenge to legitimacy because like they're like, well, we have like we're the state, we have the military, and they're like, well, you don't have most of the military. So Ouedraogo, yeah, he put so he moved Sankara and another guy who was like I don't remember exactly what his title was in the government. His name was Lingani. He moves him to house arrest instead of prison, frees some arrested civilian leaders trying to like chill everyone out. There's a divided government for like 2 months, almost no public base. Everyone's like, yeah, the government's shit. Like it sucks. The Sankarist, quote unquote, like it's a thing that like it's people rallying around Sankara. Sankarist camp, they consolidate in Po around the barracks where the military is. And they secretly meet with Jerry Rawlings' government. He'd taken over Ghana in 1979. This was another complicated figure. Marxist, I believe. But he's complicated. But anyway, Rawlings gave them support politically, militarily, and diplomatically. Like he would ship them, like they bought a bunch of guns from Libya. Rawlings bought a bunch of guns from Libya and then shipped them into Upper Volta for the Sankarists to arm themselves. August 1983. So the rebels hear that the government's planning to assassinate Sankara, Lingani, and this other guy, Zongo, because they want to break the stalemate. And they're like, fuck you, we're going to strike first. They fucking move in on August 4th. And it's really like it was like they take over the city, and it was really easy because they had a lot of civilian groups helping them out. Like they had civilian groups like leading troops around, like showing them, like doing surveillance for them, intelligence gathering, like leading them to various places. And the civilian groups were cutting off electricity in various parts of the city to help the takeover. 9:30 p.m. They seize the presidential office, the state radio station, the security headquarters, and like a tank base. And they're in control. So they form a new government, and this is where the good shit starts. They form a new government called the Conseil National de la Révolution, the National Council of the Revolution. And it's a single party. They ban all the existing parties because they're like, what the fuck were you doing? Just
Good.
like we would ban the Republicans and Democrats and the Greens when we took over. So Sankara, well, yeah, they banned the political parties, and Sankara points out that multiple parties don't mean democracy or freedom.
Nice.
True.
In 1978, Upper Volta had 9 political parties, and
they didn't do shit.
yeah, they didn't do jack shit. And he called like the whole multi-party electoral thing a masquerade that is very expensive.
Nice.
And he referred to it, the multi-party system, as a colonial deception. Like everybody has the same interests and they still get money from outside forces. It's all biased in favor of social elites. Yeah. So eventually he tried to reconcile with
The discourse is so powerful.
Sankara's energy was like off the charts.
High energy.
Like
Over 9,000.
we're reaching like levels of revolutionary that shouldn't even be possible.
Off the chart.
And so, yeah. So eventually he tried to reconcile with the ousted Communist Party, which was the African Independence Party, PAI. They had a decent base within the unions. And like their major figure was Soumane Touré. He was a friend of Sankara, like leader of Union Federation. So he was like, they banned all the political parties, but Sankara like reached out to the communists pretty quickly because he wasn't like part of a party. He wasn't part of an official vanguard. Ooh. And so, well, so this part, well, because the National Council of the Revolution, that was a party, and it was cobbled together through various parties, but they practiced democratic centralism, which was a dope way to run a party, if you ask me.
Especially if you listen to our last regular episode, which will have released by the time this goes out.
I haven't even heard that one, so I'm pumped. So it was mostly members of the military. Most of the left-wing parties had representatives in this party. There were a couple, quote, sincere patriots who weren't necessarily like leftists, but I thought they were trusted good. They gave no deadline for returning to a constitutional government. They were like, we're not going to like say, oh, we're going to return to like civilian, we're going to get shit done first. And Sankara, like in one of his first things, he announces there's not much tangible difference between colonial domination and neo-colonial society. It just changes some of the people in charge. It doesn't change the class or social relations.
Ooh, God.
Yeah.
Let me just loosen my collar a little bit, which is already very loose. It's a DP, so I'm just gonna like pull on my collar a little bit and just rip it a little bit because God damn, that was spicy.
So yeah. So one of the first things that this government does, so they're influenced by Castro and the Cuban Revolution. They set up these committees for the defense of the revolution, the CDRs. And this was decided before the coup happened by the various forces that they're going to have these committees in every workplace. Like they're going to enforce revolutionary action. They're almost like workers' councils in various, in all the cities and like workplaces and communities. Like they would have like, and Sankara just announced, like when he was just announcing the thing, he's like, "Hey, form these. Like you form these together. We'll work it out later. Just like get with like you got to fucking organize and like we'll work the details out." Which is cool, but also unfortunately there weren't a ton of written protocols and instructions for how they were supposed to operate right off the bat. So in some cases, they ended up getting dominated by like one or two people, low female representation, some cases, etc. In 1986, they had a national conference of the CDRs, and Sankara was saying, like, he was saying all kinds of stuff. He's like condemning the quote veritable despots that like took advantage of these revolutionary organizations. He said, we must now move on to a much more conscious level of organization. We must organize ourselves a lot more scientifically, a lot more methodologically, and we must correct ourselves at every step to advance, in order to advance. And we must be conscious of our weaknesses. Yeah, and so at this point, some of these CDRs had formed kind of like armed brigades. It was sort of like the Cultural Revolution in China, where people got like, some people got a little rowdy.
That's what it sounded like when you were describing the like, hey, go out and do this thing, but there's no guidance whatsoever. That's very much like the Cultural Revolution. And
so then they kind of they pulled, like, he pulled it back after a little while. The worst offenders like got replaced. Some of them got thrown in jail. And
Anarcho-Stalinism.
What?
Anarcho-Stalinism.
Weird. So yeah, I mean, near the end, yeah, like I said, in some cases they became like these like autonomous groups of unemployed and underemployed people that would go around with guns arresting people, which was sometimes kind of scary, but I don't know. Like Sankara was like, all right, you got, like, we've had our fun. We got to chill out here. And so yeah, so all right, so now I'll get to like some of the stuff that they accomplished in a minute here, but like I just want to talk about Marxism in the revolution, because this is something I've seen online a lot, and you see fucking people who will condemn Tanky's quote unquote authoritarianism, and they'll be like, "Oh, Sankara was cool," because they don't know anything about him.
Yeah,
and they're a lot of times, even in some of the research I was doing, it's sanitized. Sankara and the CDR, they're sanitized with their Marxism, and like they weren't exactly orthodox, whatever that means, but like, like they integrated some ideas of African socialism, which some people like Kwame Nkrumah in Ghana consider different than scientific socialism. I mean, Nkrumah is interesting because like he was a Marxist and ran a revolutionary government in Ghana. He wrote like a sequel to Imperialism by Lenin called Neocolonialism, the final stage of capitalism.
Damn.
But he also broke away from like Marxism-Leninism in a few key areas. Like he argued that Ghana had never formed a class divide in Europe, so some of the ideas of Marxism didn't really apply. I don't know enough about Ghana to know whether that's true or not.
Well, and so like you mentioned earlier, the fact that the French referred to was the Mosi. Sorry. Mosi. The French referred to the Mosi like power structures as feudalism,
right?
But that there's a tendency in Western like canon to impose European concepts like feudalism upon places where they never existed, because it's easier than trying to analyze it
Right.
From the actual conditions that were going on there. They said, China was a feudal state. Japan was a feudal Japan is like a huge, like,
and it's just because like that's the closest analog.
Yes, that's the closest analog that you could come up with because that's the way Europe developed. And so they attempted to impose these words, these terms upon places like Asia or Africa, which did not exactly fit. And I think that's probably where that comes from.
Yeah, and I mean, and it's a more complicated conversation that if we do an episode on Nkrumah, I think it would be really interesting to talk about some of this stuff. So Kwame Ture, the Black Panther, he called African socialism, quote, scientific socialism applied to countries that were emerging from colonialism. Yeah. So he was like, it's still Marxism, but like they're doing some different stuff.
Sure.
Like, but also some of what Nkrumah's African socialism was almost like kind of utopian sort of stuff. Like, oh, we're going back to traditional like African values, and like a lot of this stuff was like about sharing, and and that may well have been true, but like again, there's still a maybe utopian bent, which I don't. It's complicated. It's complicated.
But that perspective comes from like this like anthropological research.
You're right. You're totally right.
The 19th century and the early 20th century of like the God, what do they call it? The
Noble Savage.
What's that?
Noble Savage?
Not the Noble Savage. It's the it's trying to subvert the concept of wealth and say that these early societies were egalitarian, but wealthy in their own right.
Sure.
Which is not necessarily true.
Well, and this is what Nkrumah is saying.
Yeah.
So, it's a complicated thing.
But I think his evaluation of like what African values might have been might also have been clouded by that perspective of
probably.
It's pissing me off because I can't think of the term, but yeah, like this idea of like wealth, like reevaluating the concept of wealth.
Yeah.
I don't know.
Yeah. I mean, and it's a super interesting topic, which unfortunately we don't have time to too much dig into, but so anyway, Sankara took a lot from Nkrumah with like, a major tenet of African socialism from Nkrumah was Pan-Africanism, like these various African, like, countries and ethnic groups and societies like banding together in their post-colonial anyway. So Sankara took a lot from that, but he was more explicitly like a fucking Marxist-Leninist.
Right.
Even though there were some deviations, like a small group took control of the state and used its various like institutions use its various mechanisms and institutions to put in place what you could arguably call a dictatorship of the proletariat.
Sure.
So I mean, Sankara had a big bust of Lenin on his desk.
Nice.
For at least a period of time, the Palace of Justice in Ouagadougou had a big portrait of Stalin hanging up.
Hell yeah.
Like, you can't say that they weren't Marxists.
Yeah.
Sure.
You just can't argue that. And the thing about Sankara is he never actually called what they were doing African socialism. And he didn't limit it to just Africa. Like, he was forming relationships all over the world. Like, he had relationships with Castro in Cuba, Ortega in Nicaragua, Kim Il-sung. Like, there was a close, there were a bunch of, like, they visited each other and like had close diplomatic ties. Yeah. And Sankara said, each revolution has its own originality, which distinguishes it. Ours is not an exception. It takes into account the special features of the country, its level of development, and its subjugation by the world imperialist capitalist system. Yeah. Which is like just basic
scientific socialism.
Just basic scientific, like basic Marxism Leninism. Like the material fucking conditions look different and inform how
Marxism Leninism doesn't mean you copy the words of Stalin.
Yeah, it doesn't mean
the actions of Lenin.
Yeah, it doesn't mean it looks exactly like the Soviet Union.
It means that you evaluate the material conditions under which you live and you adapt what you have learned from history to fit the current.
That's all we've ever been saying.
It's like, why can't they understand this?
So one of the things that happens with a lot of discourse surrounding Burkina Faso and Upper Volta and all this is that it gets kind of focused on Sankara, which is fair on some level because he was like a fucking larger than life figure. Like, he was just such a profoundly like inspiring figure. But as with most revolutions, everything that happened was carried out by like the masses of people, and So that's just something to keep in mind while we talk about this.
Everybody has like a particular role to fill within the organization, and some people are better at public speaking or at convincing people of their ideas. And that's not a problem. It doesn't make you better than anyone else,
right?
It tends to make you more memorable, because then we can point to you and go, look, this is the person who gave that great speech about whatever. But it doesn't mean that all of the valuable input by all of the various people at all of the various levels of power didn't matter.
Yeah. Well, yeah, exactly.
Or that one person did it all.
Right. Exactly. It's a great man. He was a great man, but like lowercase g, lowercase m.
Yeah.
So yeah. Anyway, on the 1 year anniversary of like the takeover of the revolution, Sankara and the CDR, they rename Upper Volta into Burkina Faso, which is comes out of two words from two different languages from two different ethnic groups in Burkina Faso. Word More and Njala means the land of upright people, which is just badass.
Cool.
Nice. Yeah. And so like immediately he goes hard on what he called the democratization of international relations. And like he would refuse to grovel for aid and funding like most people would do. And he also refused to like subordinate his country and like himself to the elder African statesmen. They're like, listen, we've been doing politics for a long time. There's a specific order. And he was like, man, fuck that. And so he became a hero to citizens all over Africa. But a lot of like African heads of state got kind of concerned.
Sure.
Like, so September 1984, Sankara goes on a 10-day visit to the Western Hemisphere. He visits Cuba at Fidel's personal invite. He's granted the Order of Jose Marti. He toured Cuba, had long talks with Fidel. And later, I don't remember when, at some point Sankara was giving a speech and was talking about Che. And he said, Che Guevara is also African and also Burkinabe. Like he was, we consider him one of ours because of that. Yeah. He visits Nicaragua to check out what Ortega's government is doing. And then he goes to the US to speak at the UN. And he gives a bomb-ass speech, which you can look up the transcript of. I don't know if there's video of him saying it, but it's in French, but I don't speak French. So. But no, he condemns. Apparently not. Okay, shocking, right? So no, he condemns, like his speech is, he's just like condemning imperialism, just like over and over everywhere. He calls out Israel for oppressing Palestine. He calls for Israel's suspension from the UN, but then he delivers, like he's talking about all, like he's obviously condemning the US, like France, but then he delivers his most passionate objection to South Africa, because right now they're like in the middle of their fucking apartheid, and it's just the worst it is. He's saying, we need to kick South Africa out of the fucking UN, out of the international community, because if we're pretending to be about like human rights and democracy, we look what's going on right there. Right. And so that was super badass. And so then he's got a really complicated relationship with Gaddafi, like I mentioned before. So the New York Times at this time, they report that Sankara was a Marxist-Leninist pro-Libyan paratroop captain. And Libya sent them some guns like pretty early on, but Sankara like went on record basically saying he felt like Gaddafi was trying to, quote, impose his green book on us. Mm-hmm. And like one of the members of his government later was saying like, because people were trying to say, oh, he's just like trying to do like a Gaddafiist revolution. Like they're trying to just be like Libya. And one of his, this other guy, Valery Sommet, who was also in the government, he was like, yeah, if our revolution was based on any, it was based on Cuba's. So like, and Libya went to war with Chad in like 85, and Sankara thought that was bad. So Gaddafi withdrew support and became a strong ally and was like trying to influence this other guy, Blaise Compaoré, who was he was also in the government, personal friend of Sankara. And he encouraged the invasion of Gaddafi encouraged the invasion of Liberia by Charles Taylor, who I'll mention in a minute. 1984, the U.S. Embassy in Burkina Faso said Compaoré is working with Gaddafi and he's going to do a coup soon, which is scary.
They told this to Sankara, or
no? That was the U.S. Embassy was cabling back to the U.S.
Oh, okay.
So
they knew it and didn't do anything about it.
Well,
Well,
We'll
get to
remember
that.
this.
Okay.
We'll get back to it. And then the relationship with France, you can imagine, was not great.
Not great. Sure.
Because Sankara shows up to the 10th annual.
That's mostly because the white people in France in 1968 didn't successfully coup their own government. Even like that's
What a
like
what a tragedy.
whenever there's
Fucking
like
waste.
these like white Western leftists who
Spirit
are
of 68.
who are like, oh man, all of these people who are trying to like inject identity politics in this, don't they know that they need us to support them or whatever, and they're alienating the white working class or whatever. There's never been a successful communist revolution in a Western European nation ever.
Yeah.
So fuck y'all. Like France came the closest in 1968
They
and they
didn't.
couldn't pull it off.
Yeah.
Yeah.
So
Sad.
fuck y'all. Fuck us.
No, well, yes, obviously, fuck us. But Sankara shows up at the 10th annual Franco-African Summit with a pistol that he sets on the table in front of him. And everyone's like, holy shit.
Like a little bit of.
And so
fear
France was annually giving 55 million.
That's what Phil Spector did to the Beatles too. That's true.
We're not done recording.
The Beatles were like, "We're going to go home now," and Phil Spector was like, "Fuck you are," and put a gun on the table.
Is that true?
Yes.
Holy shit.
And they were like, "Oh, I guess we're not done yet."
Oh my God.
The White Album, right?
I think it was, or Revolver. I forget which one it was.
That's why they call it
One of
Revolver.
those two.
Oh fuck!
But so France annually was giving 55 million. I think this is dollars. I don't know what it was in francs at the point, which was 40% of BF's like annual budget. So this was like really intense of Sankara to just be like, fuck you. Because Burkina Faso owed 155 million like dollars to France. Public debt was a quarter of the state revenue.
Yeesh.
Yeah, it was bad. But so yeah, Sankara, like even knowing all this, Sankara shows up, sets a fucking gun on the table, just like, all right, what? And so France
We're
gets
gonna
sick.
finish recording the White Album.
Yeah. And so France gets sick of Sankara's shit, and like they start cutting aid. But even worse, they start undervaluing Burkinabe agro products on the market, which we'll get to that in a minute. Let's see.
Cool.
Burkina Faso gets elected a member of the UN Security Council.
Wait, so they didn't nationalize them?
Who?
Burkina Faso didn't nationalize the French.
Oh, they nationalized all
businesses?
kinds of stuff.
Oh, okay.
Yeah, no, we'll get to that in a minute. They nationalized all kinds of shit.
Okay.
But like
No,
in
but
terms
in
of
the
like
global market.
what is being exported,
Which was
from
mostly
Burkina
cotton, like-
Faso, right?
They meddled with the market to undervalue
Okay,
their
got it.
products so that they couldn't make as much money. Burkina Faso got elected a member of the UN Security Council, and they were constantly vetoing against the US and NATO. I mean, for all the good it did, but hey, you know what? It was appreciate them for
Sure.
making the gesture. The Reagan administration was obviously very alarmed, and like obviously immediately they cut aid to Burkina Faso after Sankara took over.
Shocking.
And then I'm just going through the various international relationships here. The relationship with the Soviet Union was odd, because this is like peak, like this Gorbachev takes over. He took over in what, 84?
85?
85. So it's about this time, yeah. So they were like, "Do you guys want some food, like food aid?" And some guy was like, "No, fuck you. We're not gonna do food
God
aid."
damn it.
And he said, "We decided all forms of outside control should be rejected." Yeah, in the USSR, they never actually gave much support one way or another. Like I don't think they made like an official like, "Good work, guys." I mean, you know, revisionist USSR. What are you gonna do?
Yeah.
He visited the USSR in October 1986, but I don't think Gorbachev was even there because I think he was going to Reykjavik to meet with Reagan.
He was crying in his
in
McDonald's plastic
Pizza Hut.
red Pizza Hut cup.
Reykjavik. Yeah. Sad.
He was selling the USSR to Ronald Reagan.
Yeah. And in 84, Sankara was elected the president of the Economic Community of West Africa, which was just these various countries had like banding together to talk about economic shit. While he's in charge, the biggest scandal in the organization's history happens. The Côte d'Ivoire, like the Ivorian minister of planning, I don't know his name. He embezzled 6.5 billion francs of famine
Yeesh.
relief himself.
What a fuck.
Yeah, so they put him and his accomplices on. They bring him back to Burkina Faso and put him on trial before a popular revolutionary tribunal, and they imprison him. And so
execute that motherfucker.
Well, yeah. So Mali's furious. Like they didn't even do it. They're just furious because of like they're capitalist neocolonialist fucks. Especially because in speeches Sankara would name drop Mali as a country whose people needed revolution. So the president Moussa Traore, he was like, fuck this, and started a border war in 85. Because he was hoping that it would destabilize Burkina Faso enough that another coup would happen. It didn't, but it resulted in a ceasefire. Sankara realized he didn't have really very many allies in Africa, except Jerry Rawlings in Ghana. And some of the Burkina Faso military officers were mad at Sankara because like he didn't respond with more force, since they're like, he's weak. So, at Cote d'Ivoire at this point, they're financing propaganda denouncing the CDRs and the councils and like the CNR. And like they're sending like pamphlets and propaganda to Burkina Faso, and like Sankara and the CDR, they ban it, or the CNR, they ban it. Sankara has a quote. He says, "Freedom for sincere people should not mean freedom for dishonest people." So
that's fair.
Seems fair. And we'll just do here's some of the stuff that they did. By 1986, the government built 7,500 primary care health clinics around the country. They built local pharmacies in over 3/4 of the villages in the country. Public spending went up 27% from 83 to 87. Burkina Faso was the first country in Africa to acknowledge the HIV and AIDS epidemic.
Wow.
Dope. Infant mortality dropped from 208 in 1,000 to 82, or in 1982 to 145 in 1,000 in 84, which is quick. And then September 1984, this is a thing a lot of people probably know about, but more people need to know about it. Mass vaccination. 2.5 million children vaccinated against measles, meningitis, and yellow fever in 2 weeks.
Wow.
Like, you want to talk about authoritarianism? That's, like, literally, they were like, "Hey, fuck you. We are vaccinating 2.5 million children." And then
if only Jenny McCarthy had been there.
Fuck. And then rural coverage was almost as high as in the cities. Health worker morale increased. Demand for better healthcare, like all over the country. People are like, "Oh shit, medicine's cool. Like, bring it." And then in 1985, after this, the annual measles and meningitis epidemics that annually killed anywhere from 18,000 to 50,000 children did not happen. There's 18,000, 50,000 children who did not die because of this government. I mean, there's that fucking...
Sounds authoritarian.
Yeah, well, it is. No, there's that fucking video of Parenti when he was talking about going to Cuba and like talking to the guy who like had a clinic in their village. Like, we're freer now. Like, we have more life. That's what freedom is. And that's exactly what happened here.
Right. Right.
That's freedom. Yeah. Tens of thousands of people taught to read, including many poor people and women. School fees reduced, thousands of schools built. And then he was doing like austerity to lower the debt, but specifically in the government, not through cutting social programs like everybody fucking else does in neoliberalism. Lowered the incomes of state employees, teachers, and civil servants. But it was like a genuine commitment to top down austerity as opposed to the opposite, which they always do. Government officials like had official like Rolls Royces before. He was like, "We're going to sell that shit. You're going to drive a normal car." He rode his bike to work.
Nice.
And he required government officials to wear clothes made from fabrics made in Burkina Faso with Burkina Faso fabric. He wrote the new national anthem himself because he was good at playing the guitar. It's fun.
Nice.
It'll probably be the outro. So there's a lot of actually good Burkina Faso communist music. And then, they nationalized all land in the country with the goal of stopping private land appropriation by a few wealthy farmers and urban landowners. And then the government leased it out with a preference for like rural subsistence farmers. And this also covered lands that were held under customary communal tenure, which were often administered by these chiefs. So the stated goal was to undercut the power of traditional chiefs to allocate land and, quote, give authority to designate tenure rights to new commissions that include members of the village CDRs. So it's trying to... So unfortunately, sometimes the chiefs were the only ones who could figure out like conflicting land claims. So in 1987, they come up with new land management plans that include local chiefs and planning, or at least they were working on that. We'll get to in a minute why that didn't happen. But even the World Bank had to acknowledge that like the agricultural reforms worked out well for their like agricultural production. Even the World Bank, they were like, "Yeah, I guess that was."
Yeah, I mean, the World Bank is like in terms of its data, a very useful resource.
Sure.
Like you can track like the positive impacts of those sorts of land reforms via the World Bank and even the IMF, because they keep like impeccable bureaucratic records of these things. Their ultimate goal is often to undermine those in the end. But like they do keep those sorts of records. You can find them out and like look at like, okay, well, how much did this person spend on X and what was the impact for its people? The IMF and the World Bank both reveal that.
Yeah. Well, yeah, and we'll talk about that in a second. Another good thing, in 1985, there was a campaign to fight desertification. They planted 10 million trees to fight that, which is dope.
Wow.
And then something that I think gets talked about a decent amount, and it should be, is the rights of women in Burkina Faso. Like Sankara repeatedly stated, like he had all kinds of speeches, all kinds of stuff. He was repeatedly stating that women's empowerment is not to be given by men, but it should be claimed by women. Like he was empowering women to like no, don't wait for people to give this. Like you all have, like you need to fucking take this power that is rightfully yours. Encouraged women to take control of their reproduction. Like contraception was made available, but not insisted upon, which is like he made a National Women's Day where he would encourage like Burkinabe men to like do the trade roles with your wife for a little while. You do the things that you normally expect her to do and see what it's like. Yeah, lots of like his cabinet was like the highest percentage of women in like the country's history. It was he has numerous statements and like there were policies about empowering women, the importance of women's like liberation and the necessity of women's rights to any sort of revolutionary project and how those two are inseparable. He said this numerous times and it's 100% true.
Men, listen to Sankara, please.
Yeah. I saw a tweet a while ago. It was like, there are no good men except Thomas Sankara.
I mean, anyone want to prove that wrong? I'm waiting.
Yeah. So going back to kind of the World Bank thing with the economic stuff. So economic growth was higher than the decades of the 70s, despite not doing market liberalization. They had higher economic growth. And even the World Bank and the IMF were like, oh, that's the thing that's happening. But they couldn't explain why, obviously.
Sure.
I mean, they could, they just wouldn't. And so in the 70s, there was like a global recession. And so a decrease in international trade and industrial production all over the place. And so most African countries, sort of as a result, were reliant on export of like one or two products. In the 80s, 50% of Burkina Faso's export revenue came from cotton. But there was little increase due to global like price falls on cotton, part of which was fucking meddling from France and other like NATO countries. I mean, we can and should do an episode on the rise of neoliberalism and globalization and shit. But like basically these post-colonial countries were so severely economically underdeveloped and they lacked the productive forces to sustain themselves or make themselves economically viable, which is why they were so vulnerable to organs like the IMF and the World Bank giving loans at the cost of doing structural adjustment programs. You like liberalize your economy, privatize shit, and we'll give you money to survive. And like a lot of these places, like that's just that because they didn't have a revolution, that's the only option they had was like take this shitty money. It's terrible. Yeah,
and
like the
for
World
people
Bank
who are like not familiar, structural adjustments are basically the IMF or the World Bank or anyone gives you a loan and they say, pay this amount back in this amount of time. And if you don't, then we will then get to dictate the policy under which your economy develops. So like say the World Bank gives a loan to the Bahamas following Hurricane Dorian, right? Like they will say, okay, well, you've got 20 years to pay back this $6 billion loan. And if you miss a payment, then we get to tell you what your policies are going to be within your government. And often that is, in terms of structural adjustment, it is, okay, well, you're going to cut public funding to schools, or you're going to cut welfare benefits, or you're going to sell your natural resources to this foreign private corporation. Those are structural adjustments. And it's a result of the loans which are given to these people which the people don't get to vote on. And that's the thing, is like there are billions, trillions of dollars owed to the World Bank and the IMF, which have impacted the public policy of the governments of those nations, which the people never got to vote on.
Well, the analysts that go in and sell the loans to these countries they were instructed, to overinflate the profit of these different structures that they had planned out for them. And so they'd be like, if you build this, with this money, then you're going to make this much money, and therefore you'll be able to pay off this loan in no time. And so they're like, sweet. And then they sign up for it. They get the money, they build the stuff, and then they have to overcharge the citizens because they have to pay back this loan, right? So they have to overcharge for power or water or whatever it is, or roads. And then you end up bankrupting your country, but then you still can't pay back the loan. So then they come in and
but the people never get to vote on this.
No,
which
is
the whole like
it's made by a handful.
And something I want to say is that this sort of thing is brought up a lot when people are talking about, did you know that China is colonizing Africa?
Right.
Oh,
So here's the thing. Cameroon owed China $178 million. China wrote that debt off.
Right.
Ghana owed China $1.6 billion. China wrote that debt off.
Right.
Zimbabwe owed China $100 million. China wrote that debt off.
Yes.
People like they nationalize assets, I think 2 times in I think Sri Lanka and in Tajikistan. But literally those are the only instances. That is not what a colonial power does. Or what a colonial power like the IMF, the World Bank, and the countries that they're representing do is they are extracting those assets at the expense of the infrastructure and the fucking democracy in these countries. So there's a whole thing with the trade unions that you hear about occasionally when Sankara comes up, because he has this great speech where he's talking about all these people, down with them, anarcho-syndicalists, down with them, he says, which is hilarious. But he was constantly fighting with, before the revolution, the union movement in Burkina Faso was one of the strongest in West Africa. And Sankara admitted, the trade unions make or break states here. It's interesting because Sankara was condemning a lot of these sort of upper class unions that were working with the elites in the countries. And and there was one major thing that happened where in 1984, the CNR arrested 3 leaders of one of the big unions, SNEAHV, which I have no idea what that stands for. And it caused a strike.
Sneeve.
What? Sneeve. Yeah. And so CNR immediately fired 1,380 teachers.
Yeesh.
Which is a lot. Because Sankara says, this isn't a labor dispute. This is an act of treason. And it kind of unified the labor movement. But I think one of the things they were upset about was there was an insistence on these CDRs, these councils in every workplace. They're like, well, we already have unions for that. And it brings up kind of an interesting question about what is the role of a union in a dictatorship of the proletariat? Because the role of a union is to represent workers, is to help workers fight against capitalism.
Right.
But if
beyond the reach of capitalism.
Yeah, exactly. So it's an interesting thing. It's weird.
Then you have a lot of it was the unions that helped take down the USSR.
Right.
It was the I was listening to this old Soviet economist talk about the fall of the Soviet Union. And this is just anecdotal, but I thought it was wild. But he said that during the miners' strikes, towards the end of the Soviet Union's life, he said that they would chant, "We want worker control like American businesses," because they saw it as government control, right?
Yes,
and therefore, because I guess rich individuals owned businesses in the U.S., they had this weird distortion where they thought that was worker control and that they didn't have worker control. And then you have the what is it? Chile, Allende.
Oh yeah.
With the miners' strikes there, it was a miners' strike, right? They shut down the roads or whatever.
I don't remember where they used Cyrus to break.
The solidarity movement in Poland
Yeah.
was largely led by like you can't examine structures, power structures of any sort, and say they are always forces for good or always forces for bad, because you're fucking like that's baby level analysis of like, I'm going to look at this and say government bad. Oh, government is bad. It's a structure. It is a structure which can accomplish an end.
How many layers of shitty political ideology are you on?
It's sort of like when liberals are like
2 or 3, my dude.
like when people are like, guns are bad. We need to ban all guns. If we banned all guns and the violence, it's a fucking tool, which is a means to an end.
Yeah.
And yes, it can absolutely be used to by the police to murder ethnic minorities or marginalized people here in the U.S. And it can absolutely be used by a fascist government to murder individuals that they feel like are degenerate or
Those two are the same thing.
Well, kind of. But it can also be used to fucking murder fascists, right? It is a tool. It's a means to an end, and so there is a purpose to unions within a capitalist structure in which you give power to the working class to upend or to at least minimize the impact of capitalist power structures.
Yeah,
but in the context of a communist government, it can work one way and it can work another.
So in Burkina Faso, Sankara said there was an aristocratic element amongst the working classes that lacked revolutionary consciousness. And so a lot of the unions, their vision of Burkina Faso's future was a wage labor centered democratic modernization, quote unquote, that privileged salaried public sector workers. And so in Burkina Faso specifically, unions were kind of indicative of the urban petite bourgeoisie, where they were asked to make personal sacrifices in income and status for the sake of the revolution.
They are often, even in the United States, currently an indication of like not petty bourge, but like at least, labor aristocracy. Like if you're in a union, you have power in a way that most workers here in the U.S. do not have. And the number of right-wing union workers is immense because they have a certain amount of power and they are willing to hang on to it via undermining, immigrants or low wage workers or whatever.
Yeah. So it's a complicated thing. And like, that's the thing during my research, I saw people condemn like, oh, we crack down on the unions. Like, it's complicated, man. You can't just be like,
China can fucking crack down on any bullshit union that is pushing reactionary garbage.
And
that
so
they want, and I will fucking cheer it.
Sankara gets accused of being authoritarian because of his reaction or his relationship with the unions. But like, you have to look at these things in context of the material conditions of the society. God damn it. So anyway.
Unions are not good in and of themselves.
Lenin wrote a whole thing about this.
Unions exist.
Exactly.
One of the strongest in the country.
Yes.
So 1987, Sankara expels the Peace Corps. Which is just a little thing which I thought was funny. No, but so I mean he was all about like refused food aid because he has this quote like, he who feeds you controls you. He said, there's another great quote. Like, he has so many great quotes. There's a whole book like Thomas Sankara Speaks. It's all his speeches. You got to read it. It's like, he says, don't send us millet. Don't send us grain. Don't send us wheat. Send us fertilizer. Send us seeds. Send us tractors. Because like, you want to look at colonialism, it's looking at you look at us being forced to import food and being forced to kowtow to these other powers because they feed us. And so his whole thing was like, we need to be food self-sufficient so that we don't have to rely on these imperialist and neocolonialist powers. As a result, 1987, a small group of Liberian expats led by Blaise Compaoré, who you may remember from earlier, close friend of Thomas Sankara, they go into the palace and shoot Thomas Sankara 12 times. They did an autopsy. There was like, based on the way the bullets were entering, like the bullet wounds on his body, he had his hands up when he was shot. It's just, It's interesting. He seemed to know he might not last. He referred to his wife, Mariam Sankara, as the widow on occasion.
Wow.
But I mean, he also had stuff about like, yeah, you can't kill an idea. Like before fucking Alan Moore said that in V for Vendetta, Sankara, he plagiarized Sankara. Yeah, but so basically, so this one guy, Prince Yormi Johnson, he was a Liberian politician, a war criminal now, I think. He admitted in 2008 he had been with a group of assassins and that they'd had the blessing of the guy who was running Cote d'Ivoire, Houphouët Boigny. I don't know how you say it. Other Liberians who were interviewed, they basically connected. They were like, yeah, the CIA gave us a lot of various logistical support. They gave us money and guns. France, a French intelligence officer was like, yeah, I'll have to put it in the show notes. Like he admitted, yeah, we basically helped do logistical shit for getting rid of Sankara.
Cool.
So basically a lot of people who had their interests represented in killing Sankara and replacing his government. So after this coup, Blaise Compaoré takes over with this new government. Sankara loyalists who couldn't escape, they were arrested and tortured. It just sucks. Sankara's father, Joseph Sankara, he said afterwards he considered Compaoré another son. Like Compaoré ate with the Sankaras almost every day and asked Joseph Sankara at one point to find him a wife. Joseph said he lost 2 sons that day.
Wow.
Shit.
1990, they bring back a multi-party system. 1991,
and everything was good.
Yeah, it was great, right? 1991, constitutional referendum, Fourth Republic, and Compaoré's government takes out structural adjustment loans.
Oh, cool.
Prompts some protests. Then 1994, France devalues the CFA franc, which was used by Burkina Faso, Benin, Togo, Senegal, Niger, Mali, Cote d'Ivoire, and Guinea-Bissau. And Burkina Faso undertakes various liberalizations, like they liquidate a lot of state-owned firms, wage and personnel cuts all over the place. Drug prices increased 76%. Cool. Medication was 80% of visiting medical professionals' costs. Fees for seeing a doctor increased 100 to 150%. Cost of having a baby increased like 30%. And the attitude from the people in the government down to local levels, like from various sources that I've seen, people are like, yeah, our country's poor and underdeveloped, and like we kind of are reliant on foreign aid. And at the behest of the Bill and Melinda Gates Foundation, the World Bank, and USAID, Burkina Faso is implementing aggressive family planning policies to address a perceived overpopulation problem, which Bill Gates will not shut the fuck up about.
Nope. Neither will liberals across the board.
Well, in 1995, Blaise Compaoré, he invites the Peace Corps to come back into Burkina Faso. Yeah. So Compaoré was president from 1987 in the coup until 2014, at which point there were really big social movements and protests because Compaoré was like, hey, I'm going to amend the constitution so I can have another term as president. And people were like, fuck this you, motherfucker. And so there were a lot of protests who used many of them used Sankara's image as a figurehead for their social movement. And Blaise Compaoré in 2014, he resigned and moved to Cote d'Ivoire, which is where his wife was from, who he married in 1985. And his wife, interestingly, was I think a cousin, or at least had some close relationship with the president of Cote d'Ivoire, who was always against the government. Very interesting. 2014, the National Assembly in Ouagadougou was burned by protesters during that whole thing. But that was 5 years ago, and there hasn't been a significant change in Burkina Faso's economy, because they're still trying to play by the rules of, neoliberalism,
sure,
global neocolonial capitalism. So the thing I'll end with is Sankara said in 1984, after he took charge, it was an interview. He said, "You cannot carry out fundamental change without a certain amount of madness. In this case, it comes from nonconformity, the courage to turn your back on the old formulas, the courage to invent the future. Besides, it took the madmen of yesterday for us to be able to act with extreme clarity. I want to be one of those madmen."
Beautiful. Well, thank you so much, Ethan, for coming on tonight. And thank you, everyone, for listening. Some suggested reading is in the show notes. Ethan, where can people find you online?
At ProleSpot on Twitter. No, I mean, people already know. I'm a utopologist.
I was fucking around.
You know who the fuck it is.
Our sponsors are all of our excellent fans on Patreon. As always, we have too many to read each time now, but since the last time we recorded, these are the new ones. These are the breaks. Anders, Andrew, Benjamin, Big Doink Energy, Caleb, Duncan, Edward,
Never
Eric,
happy.
Duncan, never happy.
Yeah.
Edward, Eric, Greg, Isham, Jacob, Jackson, Jared, Justin, other Justin, John, Kate, Kinsey, Leo, Lynn, Matthew, other Matthew, Maxwell, Meech, Morg, Nathaniel, Omar, Parker, Patrick, God fucking damn it, Rasputin's penis, Samuel, Seamus,
I mean,
Tim.
Critical support for Rasputin's penis as a thing that helped weaken the Tsar's government, technically. Ooh.
Totally not Shane, Yuko, Zachary, and also Zach. Not to be confused with Zachary. All of these people are inspiring and revolutionary and make it easier for us to make this podcast for you and have it sound pretty good.
Hopefully. Jeez, there was so much else I didn't say that I wanted to say today.
We've established what we're calling the USSP with several child podcasts, and we started centralizing links to it via
Central planning.
Yeah, via central planning, via various feeds on our website. Check it out. Also, we wanted to thank Ransom Notes for our intro music. Check him out on SoundCloud. Please don't forget to rate/review/visit prolespod.com. Like us on facebook.com/prolespod and follow us on Twitter @prolespod. If you have any feedback, topic ideas, or suggestions, feel free to send us an email at prolespod@gmail.com, which we will promptly ignore, throw in the trash, and never refer to again.
Sad.
Or in the comment box on our website. Thanks for tuning in. Solidarity forever.
Forever. Bye.
Bye.